Yeah, nice.
Welcome, everybody, to QPW number 34. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Yes, thank you, Phil. So this is our last webinar for the academic year 2020-2021. And I really want to thank everybody who has participated over the last 8 months. The presenters, of course, and also the participants, the audience, and the questioners. The intent of the QPW in the fall of last year was to begin to have a conversation, a space, a community for those of us who were unable to meet, to discuss because of the pandemic. And I think to many people, it's been a energetic and vibrant and important part of their intellectual and even emotional life over the last 8 months. And I really am grateful for the participation and the support of so many of you for making this a really successful series. We've had over 700 individuals attend at least one session. Many of you have attended many more, some of you almost every session over the last 8 months, which I greatly appreciate. And of course, the presenters have been a remarkably diverse and impressive group from all over the world, studying many different issues from many different disciplinary topics. And we have made friends and connections from India to Russia to Brazil to the United States, to Europe, to Germany, to Poland, and beyond. So this has been an important, I think, thing for many of us. And we will try and continue the webinar in some format, maybe a slightly different format in the next academic year. So I will send out an announcement about the format, but I think we'll be doing slightly fewer webinars, maybe a little bit more rationed out over the semester, and focused in on maybe 2 or 3 presenters each webinar, focused in on a particular topic. So if you do have an interest in presenting in the next academic year, then please let me know, and we'll put those into the discussion about how the webinar is set up. So without further ado, we close this semester, this academic year, with a presentation from Ahmad Qais Munhazim, who is, as many of you will know, originally from Afghanistan, grew up and was raised, I believe, in Kabul, Afghanistan, and worked for a number of years for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Afghanistan. I myself was in Afghanistan for a month each year between 2004 and 2008, so spent about 4 months over 4 years, and really fell in love with the country, was able to travel a little bit, and was able to experience some of the remarkable tenacity and persistence of not just queer Afghans, but straight and young and old, and those engaged in politics and those not. And I think many of us are looking at Afghanistan today and thinking about its future and thinking perhaps what can be done in these very unstable and uncertain times. So Ahmad is an assistant professor of global studies at Thomas Jefferson University. He studies ethnographically a number of things, but is working specifically right now on the Muslim diaspora and the impact of the war on terror on Muslim masculinities and indeed the queer and trans Muslim populations in the United States today. So that will be the crux of his presentation. Let me remind you to please mute yourself during the presentation and then send me a message in the chat box if you would like to be on the question list in the second half of the hour today. So you don't have to tell me your question, but if you would like to ask a question or have a comment about the presentation, then please send me a quick message and I'll add you to the list. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ahmad. I don't know if you have slides you need to share. You do. So I've made you a co-host. So hopefully you can do that. And we look forward to the presentation on queer and trans Muslims in the United States.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the very generous introduction and also giving this opportunity for me to come and present part of my work. And thank you for all for joining in. I know it's the end of the semester for a lot of you and the exhaustion of Zoom is real. So I still really appreciate you showing up here. So I'm going to share my screen while also I'll be reading parts of my work and this particular article that I'm working and hoping to submit it also for IFGP this summer. You can see my screen? Wonderful. So today I'll be talking about mainly 2 concepts that I have crafted based on my decolonial ethnographic work with queer and trans Muslim Afghans here in the United States, imperial solidarities, and also Matryoshka doll subjectivity. These are two different regimes and also possibilities of queerness, but also movements that really pushes regimes of Islamophobia, homophobia, and they also come to form in the lives of queer and trans Muslims in general, but also particularly Afghans, which are the group of people that I engage with in the US. Before starting that, I also want to remind that my work is also autoethnographic in a lot of ways, because as Andy mentioned, I'm also Afghan, I'm also queer, but I also embody a lot of the experiences that many of my interlocutors, comrades carry with them. I'm also and somebody in exile. So this poem really resonates to a lot of my discussions with queer Muslims that I have been engaging with for my research. In my body, I carry the remains of my queer Muslim ancestors. They hold me when I tremble, walking so fragilely between two paradoxical words. I exist. In my body, I carry the souvenirs of my mother. My eyes resembles those of hers that await my return from exile. In my body, I carry the reflections of my father. In every wrinkle on my forehead, I see those of his that I once resented. In my body, I carry all of me that the empire wants to erase, the queer history of my ancestors. My mother, father, Muslim, queer body. In my body, I'm a resistance. Here, I try to also, in a way, bring in Afghanistan in my work, because although my work is with Afghan diaspora in the US, and I'm also aware that the experience of queer Muslims and trans Muslims in diaspora is oftentimes also home bonded. It's in relation to what's happening in their home countries as well, because they are in constant exchanges between home, whether this is through cultural or frequent visits, or also the continuous reminders in racialized spaces that they occupy here, that they're not from here. With that, I also want to, so my main work is here in this particular piece is based on Layla Abu Lughut's major inquiry, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? In this particular piece, I asked, do queer and trans Muslims need saving? Through an in-depth decolonial ethnographic study with queer and trans Afghan Muslims in the United States, I developed the concept of imperial solidarities that are regimes of Eurocentric, liberal, white savior, middle class, queer and trans unities and sympathies that establish certain forms of queer and trans ties across borders while serving the empire's project of divide and rule. Islamophobia and homophobia, analyzing queer and trans Muslim narratives. This particular work argues that imperial solidarity situates Islam as anti-queer and trans, which then contributes to an already rising Islamophobia within and outside queer and trans communities. On the other political, and then one other political implication of imperial solidarity that I engage here with is the troubled sense of queer and Muslim belonging, both within the Muslim communities and as well as within the queer communities, which then takes me to my other conceptualization of the term Matryoshka doll subjectivity, which are these are the nested dolls in ways that queer and trans Muslims create different and complicated lives around them in order to survive regimes of Islamophobia and also homophobia. The Orlando shooting is also something that it's in our mind, especially when every year when we get closer to June 12th, also the Pride Month. The Orlando tragedy happened during a heated season of the US also presidential campaign. Not surprisingly, it generated conversations on migration and its nexus with national security in the United States. During his visit to New Hampshire right after Orlando massacre, Donald Trump used the Orlando shooting to advance his anti-immigration and anti-Muslim policies in general. In his speech, he said, the only reason the killer was in America in the first place is because we allowed his family to come here. And this is a fact, and a fact we need to talk about. This was right before the Muslim ban that started happening. This rhetoric really generated a lot of attention, both in the general public, but also journalistic circles and academia, trying to grapple with these sort of rhetorics, but also deal with the Muslim ban itself. And then, of course, the first executive order on the Muslim ban went into effect in January 2017, which was only months after the Pulse nightclub. Mateen's violence, hate crime against queer and trans lives also gave the US politicians more reason to justify the increased surveillance on Muslims at airports and public spaces, and also in their homes, mosques, and schools. More importantly, the shooting at Pulse nightclub politicized queer and Muslim identity and sexuality, while also giving global visibility to issues of homophobia and Islamophobia. In a matter of hours, the media turned Mateen from a gunman to a terrorist, and later to a closeted Afghan Muslim fag who was sexually oppressed by his religion, family, and native roots. The media speculated that his marriage failed and his second wife, and his second was failing. The first one failed, and also the second was failing while he was hopelessly cruising gay clubs and online gay apps. Mateen became queer as in failure. What do I mean by the queer failure? Failure has multiple meanings in the case of Mateen. He came out of the closet through his death. Nobody knew that he was queer until the speculation started and many people started coming forward to talk about his closeted queerness. His failure was in being queer while a Muslim person. These two identities juxtaposed in a way that does not fit the new liberal queer mold with which the LGBTQ activists in the West stand in solidarity with. He failed at living outside the new liberal closet, while also failing to live as heterosexual man he was expected to be. He even failed at being a terrorist because he was queer. Mateen is one example of a larger system that produces the faggot and the terrorist discourses and subjects, all of which demand critical discussion, which in this particular piece I try to bring in, but also building on my own mentor, Momin Rahman's work in the ways that queer and trans Muslims really exist in two very intimate yet also dangerous spaces: the familiar homophobic space and the societal Islamophobic space. Methodologically, I work in the realm of decolonial ethnography. Here, I came up with this slashing of the decolonial, because this border in between the de and colonial is where I actually exist. It's also a place that my work really grapples with, because I know that I am an Afghan who's also displaced and also working within the colonial systems and institutions that really contributes to the war back home in Afghanistan, and also to my own oppression, both as a Muslim, as a queer, as a displaced person. So I ask this continuously in my work: how can I find home even within my own body when all of me is colonized? And in the same way, when I talk to my comrades, to those I met in the field, they also were very, very aware of my own identity and positionality, that I was an Afghan. I'm a person who embodies very, very similar experiences as them, but at the same time, I'm also privileged. I'm also working with within these systems in order to survive, in order to also trouble the production of knowledge. So this slash between D and colonial is the border where my work lies, because I want to acknowledge those of us who have those experiences of colonization, but yet also are struggling in a way to produce decolonial work. And here I spent a year and a half with queer and trans Afghans, and in general with the Afghan diaspora in the US, mainly in California, and also in Washington, DC, Virginia, and Maryland, where I spent time with them and attended parties with them, mosques, funerals, and many other gatherings, and also did in-depth interviews and focus groups where I came to generate many different work that grapples both with Afghan women's lives, with Afghan masculinities, but also particularly with queer and trans Afghan lives and their own experiences. And in this particular moment, since there's a limited time, I want to take us back to Afghanistan, because as I said, the experiences of queer and trans Muslims in the US, particularly of Afghans, are very related to what happens in Afghanistan and the way queerness is produced and also orientalized in the discourses coming out of Afghanistan, particularly through a very white savior and also white narrative of queerness. In post 9/11 world, Afghan men at home and abroad became the symbol of monster terrorists, as Poor and Rai explains, and at times the effeminate homosexual. Both of these images signify a savagery, danger, violence, and a clash of civilization. The monster terrorist is there to kill and immolate, and the effeminate homosexual is there to defy heterosexuality and end human production, all of which herald inhalation. Both the monster terrorist and the effeminate homosexual become threats to liberal and heteronormative masculine Western societies. The representation of Afghan Muslim men in Western discourses moved between two dangerous existences, the dolled-up faggot and the homosexual terrorist. In the early days of the US invasion of Afghanistan, reports about Afghan sexuality, particularly the femininity of Pashtuns, started to circulate within the international community. This was through journalistic work, but also travel writers were writing about it. There were novels, but there was also even Afghan writers themselves, such as Khalid Hosseini, the kite runner that you all might have heard of or read about. So this was a time that many around the world were curious about Afghans. They were curious in a way to study them, to occupy them, and also to invade them. And they were curious about this danger Afghan man, but also the very oppressed Afghan woman, the two different narratives of Afghans that were circulating during that time. And this particular photos that you see here on the screen are of Thomas Dorzak, who is a Dutch photographer. And he went to Afghanistan in the very early days of the US invasion in 2002 and 2003. This is a time that many of the country's photo studios in many places were bombed, And so there were ruins everywhere. So he goes and finds films from the photo studios that were destroyed, and then he develops them. Once he develops them, he comes across these sort of photos of Afghan men sitting with each other, holding hands, or posing with Kalashnikovs, flowers, or wearing sandals with high heels and decorated guns and Kalashnikovs. And then this book, he titles it as The Taliban. So this is the very first sort of images of Taliban that are circulating, that this is how they look like, but it's also this, at the time that Taliban were being homosexualized, feminized, but at the same time, in the context of terrorists. However, when I look at these photos, or when any other Afghans that I have shown this during my research, we don't see that in that lens that Thomas put this, because this could be my uncles. This could be my own father in 1980s and 1990s, because this sort of clothing and eyeliner in the eyes are very common, especially in certain parts of the country. Taking pictures in the studio was the only way that we could take pictures, because we didn't have cameras. So we would go to a studio and they always had props. This could be flowers. This could be also even the lungi, the hat that you see. Kalashnikov became also one of those props because it was war. People would take pictures with Kalashnikov. In a way, these could be anyone, any Afghan, and not necessarily Taliban. So this also not only homosexualized the images of Afghans, and but also in a way, it produced that sort of representation of all Afghans as Taliban, as also dangerous at the same time, to the point that one of the newspapers, a journalist writes, quote, "British Marines returning from an operation deep in the Afghan mountains spoke last night of an alarming new threat being propositioned by a swarm of gay local farmers. A Marine, James Fletcher, said, they were more terrifying than Al-Qaeda. One bloke who had painted his toenails was offering to paint ours. They go about hand in hand, mincing around the village. While the Marines failed to find any Al-Qaeda during the 7-day Operation Condor, every village they went into, they got a group of men wearing makeup and coming up to them, stroking their hair and cheeks and making kissing noises." And this again refers, when I read it, to henna. When we do henna back home, men also do henna because it's a very dry climate at times. It also in way it covers the nails. So when he refers to nail polished nails, he's referring to the henna on these men's hands that could be anyone. Such imperial journalistic work about Afghan men's sexuality and the faggot/terrorist juxtaposition was subsequently reinforced by the Dutch photographer, as I mentioned, Thomas Dvorak. And these are the photos that really has been around and for a long time, and many people have showed it to me in ways to like try to saturate Afghanistan or discuss or talk about Afghanistan with me. This is also, when you look at this, the photo on your right with the Kalashnikov and the flowers, this sort of representation of Afghans' queerness through fake flowers, Kalashnikov rifles, eyeliner, and heels in front of a backdrop of what appears to be a Western home, and saturates the queerness of Afghans as fake, savage, comic, yet dangerous to the modern world. And these photographs also resembles, to just like point this out, this is not the same series of photographs, but then Prada, the fashion designer, took inspiration from these photos and actually did a fashion show of these European men holding hands, and in this is a major series of these. These photographs also resembles those of Malik Alula, who in a way talks about the Algerian post-colonial postcards in the very similar way of overly sexualized women, Muslim women, Arab women, yet also very oppressed in different sense. And then it also, when I was in the field and I was talking to my comrades, one of them, Zalmai 37, who lives in Los Angeles, mentioned this particular incident that in a way has stuck in his mind. He said that he was in a nightclub and somebody told him that why is he wearing eyeliner? And in a way, because he was wearing eyeliner, so it was seen as that he is that what was the purpose behind it, and so then the guy also like just went ahead and found these photos of the Taliban from the same series and showed it to him that you look like these. And that's why I'm asking you. And Zalmai says that I wear surma, eyeliner, every day because I love it. I have loved it since I was a kid because I saw my mom wearing it. When my mom passed away a few years ago, I started wearing it. Even many white gays wear eyeliner these days. One time at the gay bar, this one guy told me I looked like the Taliban with my eyeliner. And then he showed me these pictures on Google. I had never seen these photos before. And now every time I wear surma, I think about that ugly conversation. And honestly, I avoid wearing it some days for that reason. This shows in the ways that Afghans have to, especially queer and trans Afghans, hide parts of them or in order to, or censor parts of them or edit parts of them in order to avoid certain encounters of Islamophobia in the larger queer communities. And to take as to the imperial/queer solidarities, which I engage with, this is another instance where these solidarities we have talked, a lot of the solidarities when we think about the saving of Muslim men by white men through these imperial feminism have been talked about. However, my work also points to imperial/queer solidarities in ways that situates Afghans and Muslims as homophobic, terrorist, yet also the queer and trans Muslims as helpless, as vulnerable, and ready to be saved, or ready to be experienced in ways. This is a book by Micah Luengo, who is a travel writer, a journalist here in the US. Micah Luengo, a gay American traveler writer, is also writes a lot of homoerotica books about many of his travel experiences. And in one of the situations where he was traveling in Afghanistan, and in this book he's writing, he says that, talking about one of the Afghan men that he befriended, and then went to his house where also he sees his friends there in the house, and he spends a night with them. This is during the very early days, as you can see, 2004 of the US invasion. He writes that each man waited expectantly as they showed me pictures, searching intensely for my reaction. It was as if each wanted to prove his bravery, and with each photo, I felt as if I were being wooed. Carriage against the Taliban seemed to be their erotic calling card. As the night progressed, I was comfortable enough to stay over, and Ali and I slept in each other's arms after cursing each other for hours. Here then, Lingo in the main piece goes on talking about in ways that these men were dangerous, and he felt danger, yet also he was very happy to sleep with Taliban in this sense. Such exhaustization and sexualization of war and the enemy is not unique to gay erotica travel writers as Michael Lengo. Abdullah, who's another comrade that I met during my research, a 27-year-old gay Afghan man who lives in Los Angeles. But he was born in Afghanistan in the midst of war, finds himself being simultaneously sexualized and rejected in the gay Los Angeles scenes. I met Abdullah in a cafe, and we were talking about him and his experience with the queer community in Los Angeles. And he said that many times he gets, a lot of times he gets rejected directly on the apps because of who he is and the way he looks. But the times that he gets some dates, oftentimes the dates immediately turn into this question of, where are you from? I hope you're not a terrorist. How can you be Muslim and gay at the same time? And then this kind of curiosity around a Muslim man's sexuality and also performances has remained central in the case of Omar Mateen, as I started with that story. His wife and ex-wife were questioned, secret lovers were found, and they provided testimonies on Mateen's sexuality and sexual desires, what he wanted, and the way that these desires were also oppressed because of his religions. And so here, these imperial solidarities, I see this sort of writing about Afghanistan and also in a way of homosexualizing Afghans in general in the diaspora and in Afghanistan has regimes of imperial solidarities. Imperial solidarities establish gendered and sexual hierarchies, as we can see in this situation where Michael Lengo is situating Afghans as inferior, but also inexperienced in the bedroom, which and these the hierarchies between the West and the East, the civilized white and the savage brown and black, the global North and also the global South, the Muslim and the non-Muslim, and the savior and the saved. In the words of Bini, these solidarities establish new racism in international politics. Imperial solidarities are then utilized to advance projects of what I call homo empire, including Islamophobia and racism and othering of non-white sexualities and gender expressions. The imperial gay movement, a major part of these solidarities, works to uphold gay rights above anything, including security and safety. It functions to support and advance Western military interventions in other nations by upholding gay rights and pushing states and nations to come out. The tragedy of Orlando is that it positioned Muslims as sexually deprived terrorists, yet it gave visibility to queer and trans Muslims in general and Afghans in particular. And then it was also at a time that I am an activist in the larger queer and trans Muslim community. When the tragedy of Orlando happened, that was also Ramadan, and now it's also Ramadan 5 years ago. I get called a lot by journalists asking me for answers in ways that, how do I reconcile with this situation? Who am I as a queer Muslim? How do I explain what happened in Orlando? While I've never been to Orlando, I have no idea about Omar Mateen. However, just my own identities brought me to that questioning. And to the point that one of the very national radio stations called me and interviewed me for that matter. And as I was talking to the journalist, the questioning went continuously to Islam, that in what ways Islam and my own family has really oppressed my sexuality. I continuously pushed back as a scholar of these issues. I didn't want this person to even pick one or two words out of me and then switch that. And our conversation ended. the journalist came back a couple of hours later and called me and said, listen, you have a really, really good story here and something that a lot of people wants to hear it. However, you need to put just one line and say that in some way, Islam is oppressive for queer and trans Muslims. I denied that, and that story never got published. And so those are the ways that I engage with what I call imperial queer solidarities. And so the journalists continued insistence that I should, and that never in ways happened. The imperial queer movement works in ways that are deeply remnants of the imperial feminism, or feminists who Sarah Ahmad identified as colonial feminists. Imperial feminists save brown women from brown men, with the imperial queer movement commit itself to saving brown and black gays from brown and black homophobes and their backward cultures and religions, as Rahul Rao puts it. Imperial solidarities in the case of queer and trans Muslims is the understanding of queer and trans Muslim struggles through the lens of white, queer, and trans superiority and savior values. It's the erasure of Muslim identity and experiences from the very idea of queerness. And here, I want to point out to what also Karma Chavez talks about this, the queerness of Muslims and also surveillance in ways that also during the war on terror, this has really escalated. And I want to take us here to Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg is also another example of imperial solidarities, of those imperial queer solidarities that have been continuously celebrated in the queer world. However, when I was reading Pete's memoir, and he talks about coming out in Afghanistan and coming out because he was in Afghanistan and he thought, what if he gets killed? Therefore, that also pushed him to come out. And in this coming out, when I was reading, I was thinking that, okay, you went to Afghanistan and as part of military, who did you kill? Did you kill some of my ex-lovers? And so this is sort of those imperial solidarities that I have to navigate with, but also the questions that I ask when I see the queer and trans American community celebrating Pete's success and Pete's representation as the queer politicians. And then that takes me to the question, the last point, which I'm going to stop because I'm running out of time, Matryoshka doll subjectivity. Here because of many regimes of surveillance and Islamophobia in general, and the wars in the Muslim countries, I argue that queer and trans Muslims in general, particularly Afghans, have become these Matryoshka doll subjects. This came during my field work when I was seeing these Matryoshka dolls in many Afghan homes, especially those who had migrated during 80s from Afghanistan, because these were very common from the Russian times. And these Matryoshka dolls are different dolls nested within each other. And I argue that this is exactly how Afghans in general, but also Muslims and queer trans Muslims create different lives around them and to survive. But also this is could be seen as different ways of queerness, that you don't have to have this one life, this one very visible queerness. You can be queer in one space and hide that queerness in another space. You don't have to reveal all of you in all the time and to everyone. So I'm going to stop here to take more questions in the next few minutes.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. I found that fascinating. Let me call on people to send me a message if you'd like to ask a question, have a comment. Send me a quick chat message so I can put you on the list. While people are doing that, let me start off with something that popped into my mind as you were speaking, Ahmad. I don't know how much you're following European politics, but I'm sure you are to some extent. And this phenomenon of the far right, some extreme right, anti-immigrant parties that basically, at least rhetorically, embrace some gay rights principles, some queer rights sort of imagery as a sort of a cudgel of Islamophobia. You know, the Danes or the Swedes or even parties in the United Kingdom, some of them will say, we cannot let those immigrants in who are Muslims, especially because they will strip away our liberal modernity, our progress on gay rights. So obviously, this is a narrative that doesn't fit with reality because of the huge and vibrant queer Muslim community that exists. What's the intersection there? I mean, what's your impression about the attempt of the far right to sort of use, at least rhetorically, queer equality as a way of attacking the Muslim world?
Thank you so much, Andy, for the question. I have recently starting to engage with that literature, especially in European context, and I see it from that very homo-nationalist lens, the way that the homo-nationalism has been produced in the US and since September 11, in inclusion of queerness in the ideas of the nation, but also at the cost of exclusion of those who are not American enough, and they are not seen as the right kind of citizen. So it's very similar to that sort of regimes of homo-nationalism that is emerging now in the right-wing populist regimes and movements in Europe.
Thank you. Let me call on Mumin Rahman.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Qais, thanks so much for the talk. Lovely, as always. And I'm really looking forward to actually seeing more of the data from the interviews. I think that kind of evidence is really important for nuancing. I kind of, you know, that I'm struggling with this question as well. How far do you think that the imperial queer solidarities that you're talking about are really just a discourse, and I know that they're not just a discourse because there are policies and governments engage in them, and I've worked with the Canadian government on this, but they're like they seem to be really ultimately focused internally, like it's a vanity homo-nationalism. It's not really interested in actually doing anything. And I'm not sure that that's accurate, but I'm just wondering what your comment would be on that, because I'm struggling to understand whether this really means it, whether this has any power beyond the kind of homo-nationalist vanity.
Thank you so much, Momin. That's a question that I'm also in this larger work grappling with, and because these imperial solidarities, as you said, are also not so tangible. These are not. Some of them are not really policies that we can see, or we can see the effects of it. But these are also very settled ways of doing those solidarities that comes from a place of superiority complex. It comes from that white savior place. For example, I'm also in this piece talking about my own immigration process, asylum process, when I met with the immigration lawyer who also happened to be stationed in Afghanistan prior to practicing law as a soldier. And he was, and then he became a military lawyer, and then transitioned to a civilian immigration lawyer. And that sort of conversation that I have had with him during just an hour or so, it was in very that sense of, we need to save you. You're part of us because you also happen to be queer, and that sense, but also in that interview that I had continuously, he was trying to take me to the place to denounce my family, in a way blame my family, that my family is homophobic, therefore I need asylum in this space. While my asylum basically was with for many other reasons, also mainly security reasons for all Afghans in Afghanistan because of the war. And so we can see that happening also within the larger, even everyday queers do the same thing, those sort of settled ways of trying to save brown and black queers from their homophobic families or society or communities, and to establish that sort of hierarchies of power. So that's what I am grappling with in that sense.
Fabulous. Let me pose a question from Lima, who isn't able to ask it on the camera. So let me read it to you, Qais. The question is that, and they thank you for your presentation, but as the world is more connected today, keeping any sort of individuality is a battle. And how do you see different sexualities being celebrated collectively, sort of internationally, but at the same time, securing different ways of queerness in different parts of the world? So sort of maintaining the uniqueness, the manifestation of an identity that comes from a specific culture versus the sort of catch-all global queerness, which is taking over the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lema, for that wonderful question, because I do think about this queer, especially in the context of Afghan, even the language itself, when I use the queer. And that's why I take on the D/colonial methodology, because the word queer doesn't translate in Farsi. It's also an English word. It's also a word that is so foreign to me and to my experiences and the experiences of many people in Afghanistan. And so from the language to also experiences, these are sexualities that are so different in the way these are performed, the way that they are lived. And I do try to engage with that and also bring to light those different experiences, but also different celebrations of sexualities that are not able to translate in the same way with the same meaning in the context of the US. And therefore, that my critique of the white lens into these sexualities comes into play here, because growing up in Afghanistan and also now doing research with Afghans and in Afghanistan, the holding hands of men, which is very common in many Muslim countries, but also many other parts of the world, the kissing on the cheek, with women as well, and also these non-binary genders that have always existed, that have always been celebrated within the context of Islam, and also within the context of these different cultures and Savannah region. So these are the things that I engage with, in what ways that I can actually bring that to light, but also in ways to celebrate them. But even if I don't mean to put that within the context of American or within the context of the West, but leave it there as they are. And that's why I oftentimes refrain when I talk about Afghanistan, or people who don't really want to call themselves queer or gay. I just leave it there. And so, because this is their experience, and so labeling itself is very dangerous at times.
Right, and that leads us in a way into the next question from Pippa Catterall.
It does indeed, because in a sense, what I get from what you've just said is that these are labels which are being projected onto the Afghan community in the diaspora in the US that you're studying. So what I wanted to ask you was, how do your subjects themselves see the relationship between their familial Islam that they grew up with in this transposed cultural setting, and the queerness, for want of a better term, that they perform in terms of their sexualities. And of course, we could talk about a whole range of different forms of sexuality here. If you've got a sense of how your subjects have seen that relationship, I'd be really interested to know.
Thank you so much, Peppa. This is a wonderful question. And also the last slide, when I was talking about Matryoshka dolls, that's when it shows the complexities of the ways that they see their sexuality in relation to Islam and in relation also to different cultures, because Islam is one sort of seeing and lens to see their sexuality, but then the Afghanness is another one, because Islam across different regions are practiced very, very differently. And within the Afghan Muslim communities, the Matryoshka doll was something that in a way was conceptualized by my comrades, by those who I interviewed and talked to and spent time, because I was in one of the person's house to interview them, but also I was spending time with them, and I saw this on their shelf. And I asked them, how did you get this? And the person responded that, oh, this has a very long story. Actually, it traveled with us in Afghanistan, and I was very young. I remember playing outside, and the Russians were patrolling our neighborhood, and one of the soldiers threw this at me. And so oftentimes when the soldiers would come, kids would run asking for candies or pens or some things that they would throw in ways to win the hearts and minds of children. And he said that he threw this at me and it looked strange because it didn't look like candy. And I was happy that maybe candy's inside. And he said, as I took it home and I opened it, I saw other dolls. And so this is how then I saw those. And then he mentioned that I feel like now, as I am reconciling with Islam and also with my sexuality, now I am in my 40s and I know who I am. I'm Muslim, I'm Afghan, I'm also gay, and I'm also responsible to take care of my elderly parents. I feel like I'm becoming this Matryoshka doll myself, because I am creating these different layers and different lives for myself in order to survive, but also in order to celebrate all of my different identities in different spaces with the complexity that I embody them.
I think the Russian doll metaphor is really powerful and lovely, and it's actually something that I think all of us will take away from this. Let me call upon Simon Hughes.
Andy, hello, good evening. Salam alaikum, Ahmad and friends. My question is this. Are you aware of any activity that has been among Islamic leaders or Islamic scholars in any country, not just Afghanistan, including the States and elsewhere, to seek to move the teaching and preaching of Islam to a more humane and less punitive position on gay and queer issues? Because the driver for a lot of the oppression comes from the leadership, the predominantly old, middle-aged to old male leadership in the mosques and in the community. And if that's not going to change anytime soon, then the prospects are not very encouraging.
Thank you for your question, Simon. So as you mentioned, the leaders, but also those who are the mullahs, the imams, in many ways have tried to ignore the question of queer and trans in many contexts and situations overall, but also if they have that sense of homophobia is there. However, there's also, I tend to focus not on them, but I tend to focus on those queer and trans imams themselves and leaders, because we have in South Africa, in the US, and many other countries now, emerging scholars of Islam who are also leaders, but who also happen to be queer and trans themselves. So in Turkey, it's happening in Egypt. And so these are places that they really reconcile and Islam with queerness, but also they interpret Quran and the text from a very queer and feminist lens, which might not be within the context of the Western sense of queerness and feminism, but very much within the context of those regions, but also Islam itself. So those are the hopes that we see coming out, and those are the ways that I also identify with as a practicing Muslim and as a queer person, but also the teachings of those imams and leaders have really allowed me to accept my identities. And that was very similar situation for many other young generation of queer Muslims, that this is where they have actually come to peace, to have that peace with both of their identities.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Ahmad. Qais. Well, we are out of time, but I really thought that was a fabulous way to close the season with a very important topic and a fabulous presentation. And you're doing sterling and really terrific work. And we look forward to the writings as they get published that comes out of this project. So thank you everybody for joining us again. Hope everybody has a really healthy and productive and happy summer. We'll probably start again up in September, but I will send out notifications about what's going to happen with the series in the fall. So keep well, keep safe, and thank you all again. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.